It is no secret that there are many different forces attempting to engineer the direction of society towards their desired end. And sometimes in the American political parlance, these forces are described as industrial complexes. So you have the military industrial complex, which has this perverse incestuous relationship between private industry and the Department of Defense and the State Department, all of which seem to go in the same direction when it comes to our nation's foreign policy decisions, which by consequence of them being motivated by profit and not by principle, tend to take America into some very dark places. You have the media political industrial complex, that's the term that I like to use, where there is this relationship between the structures of power like the White House and Congress and the corporate media, and there appears to be a revolving door between these institutions, which makes them almost joined to the hip, so much so that it throws into question the idea of a free press that our founders envisioned, a press that actually would challenge authority and not suck up to authority and affirm authority in many different ways. And then, of course, you have this newest version of this phenomenon. You have the censorship or the misinformation industrial complex. And this industrial complex specifically is odious because it violates more than the other two, which are bad in their own right. It violates the number one core American birthright, which is our right to express ourselves without undue inhibition from either private institutions acting through the government or the government itself. It violates that. And it violates it most egregiously with the imprimatur of the government and the imprimatur of the very free press that's supposed to protect us from the wiles of tyranny. And I began thinking about this censorship, or misinformation rather, industrial complex when I saw this recent segment on Twitter from 60 Minutes. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the show 60 Minutes, it is the premier propaganda show of the corporate media. And really, I might do a video on this in the future because I want to talk about how shows like 60 Minutes and Nightline and all these different media shows, which are well established throughout American history in the media, that have a lot of good reputation because of how many prominent guests they've had on. I kind of want to explore how those shows use status to deceive people and to make people believe things that serve the prevailing orthodoxies of a particular class of people in society, particularly the political operators that happen to manage our institutions right now in this country. Different story, different day. But so this misinformation expert, that's the term that she goes under, who works for a misinformation research group called Kate Starbird, went on 60 Minutes and lamented that only 30% of their suggestions to big tech platforms, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, were actually taken up. Now, what these misinformation researchers do, these so-called fact checkers, is they will flag certain posts that they find particularly troublesome, and then they will ask the social media platform they flagged them on to take those posts down as a means of censorship. So here is a little bit of that segment that I just mentioned.
Kate Starbird says the social media platforms also often ignored the researchers' suggestions.
The statistics I've seen are just for the Twitter platform, but my understanding is that they responded to about 30% of the things that we sent them. And I think on the majority of those, they put labels.
But just a third?
But just a third, yeah.
And do you suspect that Facebook was the same?
Oh, yeah.
Wow, what do I even say? So let's look at this for a few different ways. If you look at it visually, her body language looks dejected and looks defeated. She is lamenting that her requests are not being as efficacious as they once were. Now, if someone is truly interested in pursuing the truth, if someone is truly interested in protecting society, as these misinformation groups claim they are, from the wiles of falsehood, wouldn't they instead be joyous that they are now on one of the largest platforms in the old world media, the 60 Minutes, that they can actually point out what ideas are false, what ideas need correction, and what ideas they think shouldn't be allowed on the platform. But instead of using this voluntary power given to them by 60 Minutes, they instead are dejected and sad and lamenting the fact that the social media platforms themselves will not take action to suppress these posts, which, by the way, they never really explain in detail what kind of posts are considered to be misinformation or disinformation, because the term is so broad that they can't really tie anything to it concretely. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So that is the thing that just struck me immediately. They are just sad and dejected. Then I began thinking about the moral and social dynamics of misinformation and disinformation. Well, first of all, before I get into that, we should understand something. Disinformation, which is basically the cousin of misinformation, which entered the American lexicon around 2017, directly after President Donald Trump was elected president. It entered the lexicon of Americans, and John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign person, was one of the first major figures to make a complaint about the impact of misinformation or disinformation on the public discourse. And he then urged platforms like Facebook and Twitter to push harder against these particular concepts, and he used the idea that Russia was the one pushing this misinformation, disinformation. This, of course, spawned this big Russia debacle, which we now understand was blown out of proportion and actually wasn't what they were saying it was, and we also now understand was used as a pretense to censor people and to conjure up false stories and propaganda campaigns against certain people. Different story, different day. But if we look at the actual origins of the word disinformatia, disinformation, which came from the Russian word desinformatia. It was quite literally created in the mid-1950s. And Stalin and his Soviet propaganda firms made the word particularly as a buffer against Western propaganda against Soviet Russia. Because back during the Cold War, both sides were throwing propaganda at each other. And so Stalin literally created the word desinformatia, which, by the way, didn't exist in English or in France. There was no counterpart to that word, English or French, in the 1970s. So this word is incredibly new. It only entered our verbiage in like the mid-20th century. This word didn't exist in English or France in the 1970s at all. It was still a Russian word. Stalin used this word to propagandize against the West. And I actually have a whole video on this, explaining the origins of the term disinformation and why I believe that it is actually a philosophically corrupt term. You can look at that video in the comment section down below. I encourage you to. It's a very important video because you don't have to just understand why something is bad. You have to understand why the foundation of a particular word, especially a word that is the cause celebrated, that is the guiding principle, the enabling principle of so many institutions, is corrupt at its very root. But beyond that, we have to really ask ourselves, concerns about misinformation or disinformation actually hit at something that is uniquely human. They hit at the uniquely human desire for truth. Yes, this may seem a controversial statement, but I believe that every human being is inherently calibrated, inherently engineered by virtue of their existence to want to do things properly, to want to pursue the truth, to want to be right, to want to avoid being wrong. Now, these concepts are indeed influenced by the societies that we exist in, but the fact that there is an integral part of our being that drives us to want to pursue them in the first place, that's what I'm interested in. Because obviously not every culture has the correct idea of truth. Not every culture has the correct idea of right and wrong. Not every culture has the correct idea of what it means to be a good human being in a society. That's just not true. Some cultures are bad and some cultures are good because some cultures have terrible values and some cultures have good values. But the desire is universal. The desire is so universal that we see it in our revulsion to things that don't seem to be right. If someone were to see, for example, a broken car, like a car that is smashed up in the window, and smashed up across its body, across the body of the car, most people will look at that and say, oh, that doesn't look right. Because cars are not meant to be smashed up and vandalized. They're meant to have a proper order. Similarly, our moral sense, the moral sense within us, gives us this similar trajectory towards truth. But the problem is, and this is the kicker, misinformation takes this inherent human desire towards truth, and it relies on using subjective understandings of truth to actually use it to implement policy. What do I mean? I want to introduce all of you to a concept called plausibility structures. Plausibility structures, in very simple language, are simply the way that certain people in particular groups that have certain ideas perceive what is true and what is false, what is incorrect and what is correct within the language of their group. So, for example, if you go to a person who may be a conservative will most likely say, if they're in the American sense, and I'm speaking very generally, very broad, there are many variations to conservatism, but just please, for sake of argument, just hear me out. A conservative may say that family values in terms of having a monogamous nuclear family are important to the existence of a society. A leftist who takes a more critical view of social structures may say the nuclear family and monogamy are both social constructs which oppress women, which mold children into a particular image that is not their true expression, and ultimately uphold oppression. Both of those two viewpoints, regardless of if they're correct or incorrect, obviously the leftist viewpoint is incorrect, but still, both of those two viewpoints exist in two different plausibility structures where the family is a value in the conservative structure and the family is oppressive in the leftist structure. You see what I'm saying? And so the plausibility structure that all of us have by virtue of whatever ideological camp we exist in is going to influence how we interact with the truth. Misinformation agents are uniquely, in many cases, on the left side of things because they don't really exist to pursue truth in the strictest sense. They exist to uphold orthodox media narratives typically approved by the government that typically conform to an old world mentality on how to verify information. That is, that if an information is going to be valid, it must come from a trusted institution, regardless of if that institution can be captured by political interests or not. And within that framework, that's how they decide truth. It is quite literally them weaponizing the plausibility structures that exist in the left-wing worldview and then using that as a broader way to oppress dissent and instill dogma into conversations about politics and society. That is what misinformation effectively is. It's a political tool that comes from a very specific plausibility structure, a very specific camp that tries to limit the amount people can say that particular camp deems to be wrong. Indeed, there are viewpoints that are just totally just opinions that many misinformation experts would go after and say are bad and need to be censored. And of course, there are many things that have been called misinformation or disinformation that ultimately became out to be true. For example, the Hunter Biden laptop hoax. Almost every single major news station and almost every single major fact checker was so convinced in their spirit that the fact that Hunter Biden had a laptop that had incriminating information on it was Russian disinformation. Not disinformation, but Russian disinformation. And every major disinformation expert came out and affirmed that narrative. But obviously, that narrative being disaffirmed and that narrative being pushed was beneficial towards the left-wing political tribe and disadvantageous towards the right-wing political tribe. It's no secret that there is one side whose values tend to accord towards censorship and tend to embrace different values that justify censorship are the ones pushing the importance of misinformation people on a society. That's the simple truth. They take advantage of how we subjectively perceive certain things in society, use one tribe's interpretation of that perception, and then weaponizes it against people that think differently. That is the function of misinformation in society. So not only is it philosophically and definitionally incorrect and corrupt, as I mentioned a few moments ago, but it's also functionally offensive to thinking people who are able to sort truth from falsehood, as John Stuart Mill, that great philosopher, urged us to do in On Liberty. It is an insult to them. It's an insult to the society that their forefathers birthed from these same considerations. And most importantly, it's a boon to those who seek to subjugate political discourse by force as opposed to engaging it in the same way that you and I are engaging with it right now in the form of this video. But there is a broader problem that I will talk about before I close here. And the broader problem is this, my friends. We have forgotten what it actually means to understand the truth in our modern day society. We have a culture of ignorance, which has displaced an emphasis on the truth. Now, this problem is evident to many of you, because you probably have heard once or twice in your life the oft-repeated Gen Z phrase, my truth. And one of the more common verbal tics that affirms the philosophy of my truth is, I feel. Well, I feel as if this doesn't look right, or I feel as if XYZ. You feel. If you are standing on conviction and you have a rational argument Forget how you feel, assert it as if it is the truth, and if it is not the truth, you ought to be open to critique that will break down your presuppositions and open you up towards a world where your mind will be enriched with what actually is true. Not this, I feel as if, I don't care how you feel. I care what you can assert with rational confidence. I care what you can assert with the utmost confidence of a thinking person. But all of this, going back to the issue at hand, reflects the notion of my truth. That truth is fundamentally relative. And that truth is something of a matter of perspective. That truth is a matter of taste or personal dispositions, and not a matter of external reality that all of us can perceive by virtue of our senses. So what does this mean? A lot of people will use their personal opinions, mere opinion I like to say, and they'll have their mere opinion substitute for the truth. And they will act, however, that their mere opinion is the truth. You have a lot of people today that act functionally as if they have the truth, as if their own assumptions are the truth, without testing them in a way that might threaten the viewpoints they hold. If you ask a misinformation expert whose job relies entirely on there being a problem of misinformation, what the presupposition of misinformation is, and what its significance is to political systems in a free society based on free expression, that may very well cause their entire world to crumble. Because that single question rejects the notion of their job even existing in the first place. We have to be very careful that we're not letting our own opinions, divorced from first principles, divorced from sound thinking, our own mere opinions form the basis for how we interact with the world. Because when we do that, we fall victim to the plausibility structures of our own groups. And then that allows certain people to take advantage of our feelings and use them to drive forth the agenda. Whether it's a podcaster, whether it's a politician, a tyrant, I don't care what it is. Whether it's a marketer, these things leave you open to people that might want to exploit you. And even if no one wanted to exploit you, they leave you open to error and falsehood. And a man cannot walk in truth, he cannot walk in virtue if he is a constant victim of his own self-imposed error and falsehood. Do you understand what I'm saying? The misinformation industrial complex relies on you not to pursue general ideas, not to pursue the truth for yourself. It relies on you to allow your own tribalistic understanding of what is right and what is wrong guide you, as opposed to testing that against anything that is concrete. It relies on you not testing it and not confusing the assumption that we need to have an entire industry of people policing speech in a society where a thinking man has the ability to grow. That's the entire point of freedom, to allow you to pursue virtue, not the opposite. Not the opposite thing. It is important for us to recognize what is actually going on here. That the phenomenon of private truth can no longer be allowed to persist. Because we don't have our own truths. Our feelings are not the ultimate truth. And it is going to be the mark of an educated mind to look beyond out the limitations of our experience and to try to see the bigger picture for what it is, not what we want it to be. So I say that this misinformation industrial complex, that I think that its days are absolutely numbered. I think that a lot of people are actually waking up to the significance of these kind of entities and the pernicious nature of these kind of entities in society. And most importantly, I think that the more maddening phrases like my truth and I feel are uttered, the more radicalized people are to pursue the truth over all else. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make sure we can make this channel successful. My friends, be sure also to donate to me if you want to. All that's in the comment section down below. Reject the misinformation doctrine, please. It is no good for you. It is a plausibility structure, and it weakens your mind. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.